I wanted to say welcome to everybody and thank you for coming over to the Historical Museum today. We're really excited to have Elizabeth Bars here to do a talk about the veteran experience, and I'll let her kind of talk about her background a little bit more on her own. I'm Christiana, I'm the Education Director here, so if you have any questions about programming, just give me a holler. If you haven't had a chance to check out the Vietnam War exhibit that's in our Heath Gallery, please do stop by there after this. Bathrooms are down the hall that way. And sorry, I almost forgot the important part there. So this talk is co-sponsored by the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History. Almost got it right, thanks, Kate. And also Humanities Montana. So when this talk is over, if you guys could fill out the little survey, that makes them very happy. And if you haven't had a chance just to sign in on that clipboard right there, then we know how many folks were here. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Liz.
Thanks, Christiana. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on a great St. Patty's Day. And so today, again, my name is Elizabeth Bars. I am retired Army. And what I'm here to talk about today is the veterans experience. Obviously a huge subject. So the purpose really of what I do, and I do this for Humanities Montana, I do it for other organizations as well. And as we get into it, you'll see sort of how I approach this. There's a lot of different ways to approach understanding veterans, right? In American society, in historical perspective, all of these things. But what I do is really try to open this conversation. I love that it's a nice intimate group because we can talk about things. But really what I want to do is open a conversation in communities and talk about the veterans experience. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today is, obviously, when you talk about any cultural experience or life experience, I come at this from my own background. I have a unique perspective based on where I come from. We'll talk about that. Talk a little bit about stereotypes. One of the real reasons that I think it's important for this is, obviously, a lot of people have family or friends or are veterans themselves. I think we have, obviously, veterans here. How many are here are veterans? Just, yeah. So, obviously, there's a lot in Montana, and we'll talk about that. But there's really also, I think, a lot of disconnect between the average American who has never served in the military, who's not related to someone who's ever been in the military. Sometimes we have a gap, a culture gap or a knowledge gap, and so some of this is to bridge that. So we'll talk something about stereotypes, about military culture, about how the combat experience affects, in some ways, military culture and the experience of veterans, what that results in some extent with challenges, but also the triumphs that veterans, the incredible things that veterans bring to their society. And then also what I think is a really important part of the veterans experience is the family experience. You know, most of us are not islands. We're parts of larger circles of family. And so anything that affects a veteran normally affects their family. So let's dig in. Please stop and ask. Ask me questions. This is a conversation. If it's something that's going to elicit maybe a longer talk, we can save it for the end. But please stop me during if there's something, especially if I get into jargon. Part of military culture is that I tend to use words that I think everyone knows, and my kids and my husband tend to point out to me very often that no, that's not a word that the average person knows. So please just ask questions and stop if we need. So just by way of where I come at this from, I spent 21 years on active duty in the Army. I was an intelligence officer. By way of, of course I always talk about the military. We tend to sniff at each other out. We know what patches do you have. I served in Desert Storm, Haiti, Hurricane Andrew. I went to Iraq in 2003, and then I went to Afghanistan in 2006. So that is, if you want to, sniff out my patches and where I've been, that's my background. So I was a soldier for 21 years. I always bring these up because especially when I talk to students, they're like, oh, there's no way, you don't look like you were ever in the military. Females, sometimes we have that. But that was me in the military. I retired in 2008. And like many veterans, I had to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. We tend to have to recreate ourselves, whether we get out of the military at 25, 35, or 45. So then I went on, and now I'm a doctoral student. I've done some things, and now I'm a doctoral student at University of Montana in history. And I'll talk more about that as well, the connection, I think, between the humanities, between history, and understanding veterans. So in addition to being a soldier, both my father and my stepfather were both Vietnam vets and career military. My dad was a Marine for 30 years. My stepdad was Army for over 20 years. Both of them served multiple tours in Vietnam. So I was also an Army military brat. I was a Marine Corps brat and then an Army brat. So I have that perspective. I was also married to a service member, and I was also a mother in the military, trying to juggle multiple deployments and sending kids off to my parents when my then husband and I had to deploy. And so that's another sort of perspective I bring to this. And now, our oldest son, our 18-year-old, is now a brand new soldier at Fort Hood. He's an young infantryman in the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, just reported last week to Fort Hood. He's decided to do that as a young 18-year-old, a recent Hellgate graduate. So now I'm an Army mother. So I think in some ways you can see that the perspective I bring is not just a perspective of an Army officer. I was tactical my entire career, which meant basically I served with troops my whole career. That's tactical versus strategic thing. But again, some of these perspectives of being a daughter, being a wife, being a mother in the military, I think are really important things to talk about when we talk about the veteran. Okay, so that's me. So veteran studies. Briefly, what I want to talk about is what brought me into this, starting to talk about this in various communities in Montana. In 2012, I was living in Kentucky, and we were stationed at the Bluegrass Army Depot there, and Eastern Kentucky University started a program in what they called Veteran Studies. And Veteran Studies was really the academic study of veterans. In other words, like Native American studies, women and gender studies, African American studies, Appalachian studies that they have at Eastern Kentucky University. Let's look at veterans as a unique demographic in American society and try to approach it a little bit more academically. So I was one of the early instructors teaching there. And I think it's a great curriculum. It's only taught at this point at 3 universities or colleges in the United States. University of Missouri at St. Louis, Eastern Kentucky University, and then there's a graduate program at State University of New York at Buffalo. But that's it. So there are not a lot of institutions of higher education that are studying veterans, but I think it's useful. My students, I've been teaching online now since I moved to Montana 5 years ago. But a lot of our students are not only just general students that are interested in the population, maybe their grandfather was in World War II or their dad or mother was in the military. A lot of our students are social work, psychology, and counseling students. A lot of our students are going to actually work with veterans in fields of study, behavioral health, or maybe education counseling. Places like Kentucky and Montana have very high populations of veterans. So our students not only take this course to understand the veterans' experience, but also to bring it into their future professional lives. So here in Montana, we have now started a program at Missoula College. The University of Montana, based on a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, we have our own Veteran Studies course. And one thing that we're going to talk about today, there's lots of different ways to study veterans and military culture. There's ways to study combat experience. Eastern Kentucky University has studied it from very much a social science aspect. You can look at studies on post-traumatic stress. You can look at studies about military service and looking at it from a social science aspect. The way I approach it in my class at both Missoula College and at Eastern Kentucky University, how do you understand these visceral experiences that you may not have experienced? How do you understand some of these? And I think another way to do it is through the humanities. You study history, you read literature, and there are ways, if you go back and you read ancient Greece, you read the plays of Sophocles, or you read Homer's, the Odyssey, you read about Odysseus. These are warriors who were returning home 3,000 years ago. And they were encountering some of the same things that we see amongst our veterans in American society in 2019. So you read The Red Badge of Courage and a young trooper, a young soldier in the Civil War. You read All Quiet on the Western Front about World War I. So the way that we teach it here at the University of Montana is to look at it from a historical perspective, to pull in classic literature. And there's some great resources out there that also can show a modern American veteran that, that these are things that warriors have been dealing with for thousands of years. So that's how we approach it and how I approach it in my class. So let's jump into what do we talk about with the veterans experience. One issue, I think, in American society is obviously there's a lot of stereotypes. You have the war stereotypes of the scared kid or the crazy guy in stripes or the tough sergeant, in your face, or the unflappable captain, the hero of Saving Private Ryan, right? But these are stereotypes. But this is how a lot of people, a lot of Americans, this is how they approach the veteran. And there's truth to every stereotype, but these are what they are. They're Hollywood representations. So trying to understand and bridge that gap, what is the reality of the American veteran? And what I'll do in the next bit of time is really just suggest things. We can't delve into a lot of this, but I can suggest some things, some of which we see in popular media today, but some other things which I think are a little understudied or stressed in the media today, especially when you look at the Hollywood version of veterans. They're not all Boy Scouts. They're not all crazed, post-traumatic stress, ready to go off. Those are continuums that are stereotypes that don't reflect reality for the majority of our veterans. So just briefly, the military today, a lot of you here I think already know this, but I teach this same, I talk about this to a lot of, especially a lot of high school students and middle school students. So 2.1 million in service today, 1.3 active duty, about 15% being female. Racial diversity reflects American society, I think. I think one thing the military does fairly well, other than maybe our gender, obviously, for obvious, different historical reasons, our gender differences. In terms of race and religion, the military is pretty representative of American society as a whole. DoD recognizes 221 religions and faiths and spiritual projects within DoD. And so it's really reflective of a full spectrum of American society, I think. So obviously those stereotypes don't always, it's a much more diverse than maybe sometimes some of these depictions of Hollywood would show. Women in the military, I just get asked this a lot, obviously, since I was a female soldier. Women, there are women serving in all types of different roles in the military. And there's been so much press in the last couple of years since, March of 2016, 3 years ago is when combat jobs were open to women. In other words, you could be in an infantry or you could be armor. But it's a little misleading. My generation of females, we were in Desert Storm, we were integrated into infantry battalions as an intelligence company. So females have been serving with line units, usually attached, not assigned, for decades. But we'll talk about in a minute as well, the nature of the modern American battlefield in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. There's a 360-degree threat there that there is no front line. There's no World War II style linear battlefield. So whether you're a female cook or a male truck driver or whatever, what have you, or a civilian contractor, if you're in Baghdad, rockets and mortars can hit you just as well, or an IED can hit your convoy. So when we talk about combat experience, there's a wealth of different types of experiences that is different than the World War II generation or earlier generations of veterans. Since Vietnam with counterinsurgency operations, obviously, it's a different combat experience. So a little bit a few things to think about with the military and the veterans experience. For one, obviously, you're talking about young people. For the vast majority of people that join the military are young. They're between 18 and 22 years old. So you're taking this very young cohort of young Americans and putting them through a gauntlet of training. And you're stripping them of whatever identities they had prior to that, and how much identity you have at 18 years old depends, right? But you're taking them from inner city Detroit or rural Georgia or from Guam or my home state of Hawaii. You take them from these different subcultures in America and you put them into this new place where they are expected to strip away some of that civilian identity, preconceived values in some ways, and they're supposed to have a new adherence to whatever military training and values is indoctrinated in them. So when we talk about military culture, you're talking about a very young, often impressionable perhaps, still forming, right? Forming their identities at a young age. So this process of training is meant to forge that new identity, but it also meant to forge new bonds, so that you do have bonds within this team. You still have bonds to your community or your family, but really so much more of your identity is associated with your military identity. And there's values put on top of that. These are the Army values. These are inculcated into service members. These standards, I think, so two of the big things that I think play a really big role in the veterans' experience is this training aspect, that you are trained every step of the way, and the training is usually, it should be at least, quite hard. It should be tough training. And this idea of standards, it's not like, if I were to go out and write a bad check when I was a young lieutenant, or if my son goes out and writes a bad check at Fort Hood right now, he's 18 and trying to figure out how to deal with his checking account. It's challenging. He has overdraft. But if he goes and writes a bad check, his commander will hear about it, and he will get called into the commander's office. Well, first his section leader, then his squad leader, then his platoon sergeant, then his platoon leader. He will get called in and get called to the carpet. The standards, service members are subject, we joke, that service members support democracy, but they don't practice democracy. You do not have the constitutional freedoms as a service member that you have. You don't have freedom of speech, you don't have freedom of association. There are a lot of freedoms you don't have. You are subject to a different level of standards and personal responsibility than the average civilian. If my son bounces a check, he will be in trouble. If my kids, did graffiti on a wall, when I was still on active duty, I would have been in trouble. My home could be inspected at any time to make sure that I was, clean and taking care of my home and taking care of my kids. The personal privacy barriers that we have as civilians are not part of the military. And the reason of that is obvious. We need the whole family to be ready for war, not just the service member. So the family has to be healthy to allow that service member to deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan. But that puts that whole family under a microscope, So this idea of standards, this idea of values, and being drummed into you these values, whatever service you're part of. And this idea of constant indoctrination and enforcement. Every service has some creed that they try to hone. And obviously, these standards and this training is going to be absorbed by an individual service member to greater or lesser extent. I was in for 21 years. I'm the daughter of 2 veterans. None of my life has not been I've got 53 years now of military indoctrination. And if you serve 4 years, maybe it's a little bit less. And different personalities absorb it differently. But I would argue to some greater or lesser extent that every veteran absorbs some of this. This idea that they're supposed to be living to this level of being on time, being squared away, this level of serving something greater than yourself. And those ideals and that camaraderie is all absorbed, again, to greater or lesser extent. Yeah.
So, for example, we talk a lot about, the warrior ethos.
Yeah.
In your opinion, do you think we still have that in the military?
I do. I mean, and I've been retired 10 years.
I've been retired for 30.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, I guess I'm a little different just because I've never really part of the regular army.
Yeah.
I mean, when I see some of the things, like I will always place mission first, right? I mean, that used to be, you're better.
Yeah.
There is no other way.
Exactly.
But it seems like it's not like that. And it's not. And I'm not trying to make it a political issue. I mean, even within SOCOM, it's like now we have to be so. SOCOM is almost done like at 180 when we become like the regular army now.
Yeah.
Right, because I get it. The generals were tired of getting calls because we have beards, but I mean those are our regulations, right?
Yeah.
We're authorized to wear that.
Yeah.
But now all of a sudden it's like when I hear all this, and there's nothing about like transgenderism or whatnot. But for example, transgenderism, right? Mission first now comes out of the office because, my transgenderism becomes before the mission because if I got to go on hormone replacement therapy, I'm not deployed.
Yeah.
Right. So now you're taking but you're still going to be required, or you're still going to demand, right, to get promoted with everybody else.
It's
and that's where a lot of those things come.
I know.
I have a hard time with that. I took that as
No, and I know. And I think that's, as a service member, what you're talking about is exactly the same. When I get a question about female serving, when I get a question about females going to Ranger School, when I get a question about transgender serving, my first question is, and you know what, my identity is honestly, my identity is soldier, way before a female. So my first question is, are they lowering standards? Are the standards being lowered? And I think that is a culture. I agree with you. I think that's a cultural idea that as a veteran, you want to know that the standards are being met.
Because they're not now, I promise.
Well, and it's interesting, and I think we could talk about this a lot. I had a buddy of mine was at the Ranger Battalion when the two first females were going through Ranger School. He told me, he swears that they did not lower the standards for those two.
I got instructed buddies.
And exactly.
With them.
So it's
they're Russell Lighter.
Yeah.
In the swamp phase.
Yeah.
Brigadier General, I'm not making his name because the camera's rolling. But he went out and walked with the two females.
Yeah. See,
when has that ever been done in Ranger history? Never. So now we are lowering the standards, right? And that's what I have a problem with. And it's not. I don't care if I got a female, if you can go out and you can go to selection and you can carry 130, 140-pound rock for 20 hours a day for the next 6 weeks, dude, feel free.
Yeah.
I'll take you on the team. Because there's a lot of guys. But then again, right, we only hear about the women that didn't make it. There's also 300 guys that didn't make it. You don't hear about them.
Yeah.
So now we're already changing the policy, right?
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about is a great point here. Is I think the culture of the average of the military culture, the average veteran, is that you don't ever want to reduce standards. You want to have full diversity, you want to have full equality, but you don't. But like what you're saying is, I got one perspective from my buddy there. You got another perspective, obviously. But what it both points to is that the number one consideration of the normal veteran is going to be don't reduce standards. So, no, that's a great point. I'd love to talk about more at the end. And so, what is that? But let's translate that then. So, what does that mean if you're the veteran and you care about diversity, you care about equality in American society, but you leave the service, you care about the mission, right? And that's an attitude. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but that's a critical attitude that a lot of veterans bring into their post-military life that will affect them for the rest of their lives. My poor kids will tell you that I am the worst nagging mother because they have to live up to these certain standards, and I have to back off and remember that, the perfect standard. But standards are incredible. So let's talk more about that. I think it's absolutely a great point. Yeah.
Growing up, do you think that your father and stepfather kind of ingrained these kinds of Army values and standards into you as parents and in their parenting style, or is that something that...
Yeah, so it's a great question, because military parenting is a whole other subject, right? To some extent, I think they were pretty. First of all, they did. I mean, I was not. There was no idea that I would ever go into the military until I was well into college. So they didn't. It wasn't from that perspective. But yeah, I mean, I think the be all you can be thing. Try your hardest, work really hard, but most parents do that. So I don't think I had any other. I didn't have the great Santini father. My dads were both incredible men and incredible role models. But there's always a bit of that perfectionism and be all you can be. That was the motto when I joined the military. Yeah. Military parenting is another great question. So military culture. So when we're talking about military culture, obviously, these are the definitions that anthropologists and sociologists and others use. But it's really this set of ideas, this set of values that you develop over your life, whatever culture you belong to. And so I would argue that veterans are a subculture within American society. And when I say veteran, let me define that very quickly. Veteran obviously is anyone who's ever served in any capacity in the military. I've had veterans that come up to me and say, hey, I served for 2 years from 1958 to 1960. I never was in a war. I don't consider myself a veteran. Well, of course you're a veteran. I was in the National Guard for 2 years. Well, you're still a veteran. So but those are, again, some of those cultural ideas where some people feel like if they've never been to combat, if they've never gotten this patch or that patch, they're not. And that clouds also how people perceive, veterans' culture and their own identities. But for the sake of time, too, because we can get into this, just what I'm saying when I talk about culture is really this unique identity that is often created in the veteran based on education, based on training, based on language, this unique language that most people use, traditions and experience, whether it's peacetime or war. And this subculture thing that we talked about. JSOC has a very different subculture than the United States Air Force. Marine Corps has a very different subculture than the Coast Guard. So there's all these, within military culture, there's obviously tons of subcultures. And I joke, you get a Coast Guardsman and an airman and a sailor and a Marine and a soldier in a bar, and they will just be at each other talking about who's best and what tab you have, and oh my God, the Air Force and yeah, exactly. The Rangers and the SF guys will be at it. But I tell you what, you get some civilians come into the bar, and then they're all of a sudden on the same team, right? So there's all kinds of subcultures. I talk about there's a lot of that sniffing around, the patch sniffing, but it's still, these subcultures exist, I think, within a larger framework of culture. So let's talk about impacts of culture a little bit. A few things. About 7% of Americans right now are veterans. That fluctuates. 1 in 10 Montanans is a veteran. We have the second highest concentration of veterans in the country. 1 in 10 in Montana. So depending on how you count it, working age or not, Maine or Alaska have the highest concentration. So there are a lot of per capita veterans in Montana. Family members, if you count family members, about 1/3 of Montanans belongs to a military family. That's a lot in our state. We've been at war for 17 plus years. Our son will be deploying to Afghanistan shortly, and he will be in the same war that I was in 2006. This is now a multi-generational war in Afghanistan. Even if it's peace, training or whatever it is, we still have service members in harm's way. Multiple tours of duty. Most service members have served many multiple tours of duty. Anywhere from a 4-month tour of duty, maybe if you're an Air Force or Navy, up to 15 or more months for the Army. Disability claims. This is another aspect of the veterans' experience that I think is important. A lot of times the issues that veterans have, physical issues, back problems or post-traumatic stress, they don't a lot of times manifest until maybe you retire, maybe you're in your 60s or your 70s. So World War II disability claims for the VA did not peak until 1980, about 1985, 86. Vietnam era disability claims are just now peaking. So this is also when we send our nation's treasure into harm's way is a project that will encompass national resources and community resources for decades. So it's just another framework to think about this. So let's talk a little bit. I want to talk briefly again. I'm a history doctoral student. My focus is political and economic history. I decided to go back to school. I'm not a military historian, but I think studying history is just like studying literature, is one way to understand not only historic experiences of veterans, but even modern veterans, as I've said. And so when I teach my class, we go back to ancient Greece, but then we come and we look at things like the Revolutionary War, and there's themes that you can bring out. What are some of the themes that are eternal, basically, for veterans? One is this idea of transition. How do you take a young person, a young man in the Revolutionary War, putting them into some kind of a uniform, if that, throw them into a place and a situation where they will have to kill, where they will have to consider being killed. The coarseness of, sometimes military life, and the sheer, the sheer difference that it has from let's face it, especially in modern America, the modern, fairly cushy lifestyles that most of us are fortunate. So these transition to warriors, if you look at the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, obviously there's this great, there's this ideas of physical hardship. We don't have that as much now. We live a lot better. We've got nice hot chow and we get showers once in a while. But this idea still, though, even in the modern battlefield, of physical hardship, long nights, not a lot of sleep, tough physical environments, sort of an eternal through American history. And going back and we look at Valley Forge, my students look at Valley Forge and they look at the Civil War, and they get more of that sort of visceral idea. We talk about embracing the suck. This is also a military value. You embrace the suck. It doesn't matter how hard it is, you just suck it up. And how does that translate, though? If you're a service member, a soldier, a sailor, Marine, and then you are taught to embrace the suck, and then you transition to civilian life, how does that change your worldview, So these are just some interesting things that I think are important. When I teach, we use excerpts from All Quiet on the Western Front. Something that gets lost in modern conversations about service sometimes is the simplicity of war. War can be terrible, it can be scary, it can be all of these things, but it can also be immensely, immensely simple. If you've seen the movie The Hurt Locker, Jeremy Renner is in the grocery store. His wife sends him to the grocery store, and he's looking up and down the aisle to pick out some cereal. And there's 150 different types of American cereal. And when you live in an environment, whether you've been to combat or not, the military can sometimes be very simple. You have to have a clean uniform, and you have to do your job. You have to stay in shape. You get chow pretty much. Your life is not dealing with picking out breakfast cereal. You don't pay taxes while you're deployed. You don't have to worry about the car breaking or the kids having a cold. You don't have to worry about doing a lot of these things which in modern American society are really, really, really hard. I mean, they're just hard. They're chaotic and they're hard. So even the character in All Quiet on the Western Front, as terrible as World War I was, recognizes the simplicity of life in combat. So these are themes that we can bring out in looking at historical ideas of veterans. Other wars, obviously, there's other important things that you can learn from historically about veterans. The forgotten idea of the forgotten war. What happens when a country sends its young people off to a war that really nobody in the American public is paying attention to? Korea was one of those early wars. Obviously, the issues of Vietnam. What happens when you send people to war and the public hates the political act, and then anti-war becomes anti-veteran. Both my dads experienced this coming home from Vietnam, obviously. It's a wonderful, Leon Howard's display out here I would encourage if you haven't seen it. It's a great, it shows a young man being sent to war in 1968 and what happens when you come home from that as a veteran. What happens 51 years ago, yesterday was the anniversary of My Lai. So how many Americans have this perspective of Vietnam as only being, the atrocities that were committed, which happen in every war, tragically. But when that stigma comes onto a veteran and the veteran comes home, so studying Vietnam brings some of these themes to understanding what, especially that generation of veterans have been through. And then my first deployment was to Desert Storm, where it was a completely different environment for coming home. I think America had gone through a catharsis and wanted to welcome home its veterans and make up for some of that from Vietnam. So then there's this over-the-top outpouring. If I had heard Lee Greenwood's song one more time, it was just this outpouring of support, which was amazing. It was amazing, but it was a very different veterans experience for those of us who came home from something like Desert Storm. Separating the veteran from the political decision is another interesting way to look at the veteran's experience and study. And then, of course, our most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, these ideas that, like in Vietnam, it is not a linear battlefield. It is a battlefield where the average, if you're out on a patrol, it is 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Because even if you're back at your forward operating base in the Korengal in Afghanistan, you have mortar attacks. So it is a 360. These soldiers and service members, soldiers, Army, but soldiers, Marines. They are on alert 24 hours a day, and their life is threatened 24 hours a day in a non-linear battlefield. What does that do psychologically? What does that do to that unit and to that individual when they come home? So these are just different themes that I think studying the history of these various conflicts can help us understand about veterans. And again, the long war, there's that saying that we were at the mall, we were at war when Americans were at the mall, this feeling of alienation in a war that's not World War II. It's not World War II or World War I where the entire country mobilizes, and we've been there for 17 plus years now, I think going on 18 now. What happens when you're a veteran and you feel like, you come back and you feel like maybe people haven't focused on what you were doing and the sacrifices you were making. So these are all themes that are, I think, really valuable to learn from, not only from these histories, but the incredible, there's great, and I'll pull it out here at the end, I meant to grab it, there's great stories that are written about these conflicts too. Young veterans today writing about their experiences from places like Afghanistan. So what are some of the results of these combat experiences when we talk about the veterans' experience? Obviously, there are physical challenges that veterans face. It is not like World War II or World War I. The forward surgical teams now, the quick evacuation, we have an entire generation of veterans that are surviving horrific injuries like no other generation. Because of the ballistic protection for most in a Humvee or on an individual service member's body, the traumatic brain injury of being shaken inside of a Kevlar helmet, you can survive and look like you have no injury, but you've been literally shaken up like an NFL football player after 20 years in the NFL, after a year's deployment. So these are physical challenges, quadruple amputations, things like that our service members now are living with, that no other generation really has had to live with. These are statistics, but obviously you can see, without going into a lot of detail, these have incredibly difficult challenges, but they also have incredible positive challenges. These are veterans that are going into society becoming Paralympians. They are still, whatever injuries they have, going in and doing incredible things in terms of athleticism, in terms of jobs that they're doing. But obviously they're challenges. And then who takes care of some of this generation of veterans? Quickly, post-traumatic stress obviously gets a lot of media attention, and in post-traumatic stress that I teach my students, I think we love to talk about everything that a veteran ever goes through as, oh, they've got PTSD. post-traumatic stress, and I'm not a psychologist, I have no psychology background, but it's basically a reaction to fear-based trauma, to having your life threatened. It's that reaction to that. It's an extreme fight or flight response, to use layman's terms. What I think is important to understand about the veteran's experience, though, is there's so many other things that are not post-traumatic stress that can affect a veteran. So when we talk about this military culture, I mean, post-traumatic stress is very important. The suicide rates among our veterans is very important. But there's other things that affect veterans, things like you're with this group of, the camaraderie that you have in a unit. You're living on a post with your family for, let's say, 10 years, and then before you get out. When I lived in housing at Fort Drum, New York, I spent a lot of my career at 10th Mountain Division. On our block alone, there was 20 other boys my son's age. He was a second grader. 20 other kids his age. It was a tight-knit Ozzie and Harriet community. My kids all had, my kids had friends that were kids. It was a very tight-knit community. Every family had been through deployments, had been through casualty notifications. And that service member is working with people who know exactly what they go through day to day. You take that service member and they retire or they get out and they go back into a civilian community. Some of the emotional issues that our veterans go through are not just post-traumatic stress or, reoccurrences of trauma. Sometimes it's just they miss it. They miss that camaraderie. They miss the getting up at 5 o'clock every morning and doing hard PT, physical training every morning. It's an entire lifestyle that changes for them. So just, if you're, interested, the things about veterans I think that are important are not the things that are also short of post-traumatic stress. Those things are profoundly alienating when you go from a very cocooned, very intense military culture often into a culture that can be very different. I have my student veterans sometimes say they don't understand why their fellow students are, complaining about having to be at an 8 o'clock class, or, oh my gosh, you guys are complaining about ridiculous stuff, Again, that simplicity, right? Their life in combat was very, very important, but very simple. And so there's a dissonance between sometimes civilian culture and what's important, sometimes with service members and what they consider important. Again, I'm talking in generalities. Yeah.
We did some studies over with SOCOM, the 18,000. So we started a bunch of it. And one of the things we kind of started looking at, and then I got wounded and spent years in the hospital and got out, so I don't really know what happened to the study, but with, because if you look at most guys like in my field, for example, right, we don't have the traditional PTSI maybe that you can see the regular ones, for example. Yeah. And what we kind of came down to was like saying, because everything that I've done in the last 18 years plus a war, I have no PTSI. I mean, it doesn't bother me. I knew what I was getting into. I knew that there was a big chance of me getting wounded and possibly killed, and I was okay with that. Then I realized it was back in 2005 in Balad. We were about to head out, and my team sergeant came up and he's like, "Hey, Mark, their PAs haven't come in. Can you spend another week at the hospital and help out?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." So long story short, 8 weeks later, I was still there, of course. They never showed up, and I was running my side of the ER, and the other docs were running theirs. That gave me more PTSI than I've ever had from anything else. And I think, for me, what it was, I don't know how else to put it in other terms, but there's no revenge. Right? If we take casualties, we know the next night we're going back to that village and we're going to fucking clean house. Excuse my language. Right? So they know, that, and that's why if you look at 2008, up on the Syrian border, the Beardy ones, right, they called us, right? They knew. We shut the whole Syrian border down in 4 months. There was no coalition attacks, no American attacks, or attacks on coalition forces or Americans, because we made it very clear that if you hit anybody else, we're going to come here, we're going to kill, capture every single Al-Qaeda member you have. And whether that be your whole family, it's not a problem.
But you're active, you're doing something,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And I noticed like a lot of these nurses, man, I was like, what are you guys crying over? I don't get it. Well, after 8 weeks, I got it. It was I was devastated when I got back. I was just like, dude, I can't do this again. I'll go back to war, but I am not going back to a hospital. Dude. There's no way. 20 hours a day, right? You deal with, I've had it's kind of funny, you know, God Bless America, right? I hate that fucking song with everything I have. Just because of the fact that, you know, we worked for 5 hours in the OR on a kid. We shot through the head, across the midbrain, so, I mean, we knew there's definitely going to be some damage done. Maybe he won't survive. For 5 hours, man, I was working on one artery, it's ethmoid artery, trying to get it clogged off so it wouldn't keep bleeding. Doc came in, close him up. If he doesn't make it, we've got a mass cal coming in. And I was like, dude, I just spent 5 hours on this fucking kid, man. What's wrong with you? And as soon as we draped the coffin, it was it. I mean, he bled out, you know. That's when they played that song. That's why I hate that song.
No.
But you know, but it was such a weird feeling for me because, you know, I don't want to say revenge per se, but I don't know, payback. I don't know how you want to call it. They're going out there and facing that enemy, right? And then all of a sudden in the hospital, we got, well, you know,
you feel hopeless.
We got mortared every day, man. I mean, it was just mangled kids coming in, and I was just like, how the fuck do you, excuse my language, how do you guys deal with this? Because now I'm this badass bearded, you know, killer, right? And I'm like, dude, you broke me. 8 weeks, man, you broke me. You know, but I wanted to go back to war, just never back to a hospital. And that's when we kind of started thinking about, like, maybe that's what's going on with, especially, I hate to say, the medics and medical personnel. Because they get the shit out of the stick every time.
I mean, this is a perfect segue into this, but it's exactly what there's so many psychologists. I mean, there's something called secondary post-traumatic stress, and I'm not a psychologist, but a lot of docs will tell you, no, and a lot of researchers and docs will say, well, there's something called secondary PTS, but there is so much more work now being done on this idea. It's a lot of it, Jonathan Shea, who's written 2 books, and he uses Greek tragedies to talk about this. But this is exactly what you're talking about, is this idea of maybe that your life wasn't threatened, but you've gone through this experience of moral injury. And it hurts, right? Studies of nurses in Vietnam, you go all the way back to Walt Whitman, the poet, the writer, American writer during the Civil War, and you read his writings from the Civil War. Walt Whitman is talking about moral injury and secondary post-traumatic stress because he's dealing with these young boys dying in his hospital in Washington, D.C. as a nurse. And he has moral injury. His moral compass has been wounded because he's witnessed and been helpless to help. And so, you know, whether you call it secondary post-traumatic stress or moral injury, these are real injuries that service members have that aren't, you know, not under this rubric of post-traumatic stress, but they're very real. It's a great point. Things like, you know, even when I was in Baghdad during Abu Ghraib, knowing that my unit had nothing to do with Abu Ghraib, but just being part of that, knowing that these, you know, bad things were happening, and I was in a war that was doing some bad things, you know. These are different transgressions that service members have to deal with, and that's a great point. Our caregivers have to deal with this so much.
But I mean, for example, with Abu Ghraib, right? I mean, like I said, you know, we all have our discipline. I mean, I'm more of, I guess, you know, gloves come off, war, fighter, because we do work under different authorities, obviously, the regular army. You know, and I'm not condoning any kind of abuse or torture of anybody. That's not tape, right? You shut it off now, get down. No, I'm kidding. But, you know, I mean, because I hate to say it, but like a lot of guys in the unit, right? I mean, we heard about them, great, like, okay, so what?
But these are ethical dilemmas, right?
Right, because, I mean, for what I've talked about with, I'm still trying to get out there and talk to high schoolers, because I see so many kids, oh my God, you need a green beret. I know you do. You want the beret, I'll get you one. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on that you probably are not going to make. Anyway, you know, because at the end of the day, right, I mean, let's be honest, we're the only ones that follow the Geneva Convention. You know, it's kind of like saying, okay, how do you win an unconventional war by conventional means? You don't.
But that's exactly, I think, the idea is that you're taking these young Americans. I mean, again, My Lai, you know, the anniversary of My Lai was yesterday, 51 years. But you're taking young Americans and putting them in incredibly difficult ethical dilemma situations. You're making them make life and death decisions about what to do on the ground. And a 22-year-old corporal is making this decision on the ground in a place like Afghanistan. So, yeah, and these are just incredible, great points. But these are tough issues that our service members have to deal with, whether it's something big or just a small thing, like, you know, anyway, the small things, yeah.
Just a real quick question. Do you have any sense there that the people who are exploring moral injury think it could ever rise to the level of a medical diagnosis like PTSD?
I don't know enough about it. There's guys like Jonathan Shea, a psychologist. He's retired now. He worked in the VA in Boston for years with Vietnam veterans. I mean, I think that it's not in the DSM, the diagnostic manual on psychological conditions, but I think there are more psychologists talking about it. I don't know if it'll ever get into the DSM, but maybe.
DSM every 15, 20 years. So I think after 20 years or more, I think.
Yeah.
Well, it's a whole different.
We'll have to revise it somehow.
Because it's a whole different scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, we've never been at war for this long, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, like, for example, having been in for 21 years, right, I got to go quite a few times. And the thing that I had a hard time with was, even at the vet center or the VA coming down there, and they're like, oh, so, I'm good. Sure, I'm like, because I'm not. We give you a lot of meds, okay? I'm like, for what? Because we're sure you're pretty fucked up.
Yeah.
Huh. Then you start like, okay, maybe I am jacked up.
Yeah.
Long story short, I got wounded, spent 2 years in the hospital. I had to learn how to walk and talk again. So they kind of forced me in. Well, they wheeled me into counseling. I didn't have a choice. Locked my wheelchair, and that was it. But, and I hated it, right? Because it was a group counseling session, right? And I'm sitting there with, like, next to me was a female that had been brutally raped down there, right? And I'm sitting there like, what's she going to learn from me? What am I going to learn from her? And I hated my life because I woke up after a coma, and I was in the hospital. I'm like, where's my team at? Well, you've been here for 6 weeks. I'm like, bro, I was like, this ain't happening. And then I realized, of course, and so forth and so forth. But with that being said, I think we have to start looking at PTSI. I call it an injury.
No.
Because I don't think it's a disorder
Yeah.
at all. And I do have PTSD. But because of the duration of it, like you said before, I mean, you say an 18-year-old, you put him on war for 24 months. Right? Yeah, okay, you get 2-week break to go home for Christmas, but I'm telling you right now, some of the kids that I see here in Missouri, I've only been here 3 years, they'll never make it. Some of these guys, I mean, I see the ROTC program they have in universities, it's a joke. I'm absolutely baffled that they even allow that stuff to go on.
And what you're bringing up is that issue of training. I mean, and I think that's why, I mean, the military, how good or bad it is, if you are not trying to train to prepare young service members to encounter these ethical problems, these physical challenges, and that's why we train. This is why hard training is absolutely imperative. And so when you get into this culture thing, and you have a service member who leaves that culture, that you have to be hard at everything you do because it's a life and death situation, how does that service member then deal with regular life? Talking about being a parent, right? Yeah. Go ahead, and then we'll go.
Military members, so not only that they can survive and do their mission, but they can transition to civilian life after they leave the military. Well,
and again, we could talk about this all day, but briefly, let me tell you. So we've talked about these challenges, right? This great segue. Good time to bring this up. This is not all bad. I mean, let's face it. The average veteran came home from World War II, got their GI Bill, went to work, made an incredible contribution to American society. The average veteran is coming home today and doing great things. They start nonprofits more than the average civilian. They join nonprofits. They go back to school. They raise families. This is not a story of dysfunction, even though that's what gets the press. There are some things being done in the military, things like resilience training. How do you teach someone to be resilient? Rhonda Cornum, a female flight surgeon who was shot down in Desert Storm and was sexually assaulted as a prisoner of war when she was captured. She talks about this. How do you, it's also called growth, right? How do you take a tragic situation or a bad situation and grow from that? I think there's a lot being done in the military to help teach resilience. Part of it is teaching before you deploy hard, tough training, hard, tough ethical training, knowing your job and being part of a cohesive team so that you don't develop PTSI. I agree. I consider it an injury. Yeah.
When I was a Fort Bragg, they felt close, so I lived next to a couple other people. And one of them was a couple. I think they were flight medics or flight surgeons or something like that. And it was really crazy to me, because they would see me come in, home after 4 or 5 months, sometimes I would be just like, oh my God, hey, what happened? And then I was like, hey man, you guys get ready to deploy? Like, yeah, this is going to be our 3rd deployment. Good for you. what are you guys training on? It's like, well, you know, we've had like 8 sexual harassment briefs. We've had 25, you know, don't beat your spouse brief or whatever, right? Oh, okay, you guys qualify with your weapons? No. Okay, I say, so I think we kind of lost fucking focus on war.
It's got to be.
And again, it goes back into the whole, and there's nothing against civilians. If anybody hears a civilian, I don't hold anything against anybody. But we've allowed a lot of that stuff to come to resiliency, right? Dude, you can show me 8 million PowerPoint slides. I'll take you outside and put you through 24 hours of fucking hard training. You're going to get 10 times more out of that and get ready for war than you are through PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the problem.
Well, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one thing that is good. I mean, there's still a lot of power. There's a lot of death by PowerPoint in the military, as we're doing here. There's a lot of death by PowerPoint. But there's also training in MOUT sites and urban terrain sites, and we've at least incorporated some of that. But it's tough. I mean, it's a tough thing to incorporate. Yeah. Well, hopefully veterans at this point. But yeah.
That's the thing, right? They take one E5 who's been downrange, who's a truck driver, right? Yeah, you might have been seeing some IEDs. Well, you've been downrange, so now you're going to teach room cleaning.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, you're taking these young kids that have never done anything. You know, I mean, and that's the kind of stuff where I started looking at, like, and I thought it was a purely military thing, but it's not. Because I came out here trying to work with law enforcement here, and they're like, nah, man, we're SWAT, bro, we got this. And I'm like, no, you don't, right? But again, how do you, because I think that, obviously, if you guys know this now, I love to debate, right? But I mean, I just think there's a lot of things, because we're not talking about anything, you know, and even in, I mean, I went down with one of the kids from the gym that I trained at, you know, because he was going to see a recruiter. You know, and all the stuff he's told them about the X-ray program, which is basically you go straight in, go through basic, they train you for selection, you go through selection. And he's sitting there telling this kid, dude, you're going to pass, man, it's not a big deal, da da da. And I'm sitting there looking at him like, dude, when I went through, man, they damn near killed me. I'm like, what are you talking about, right? I mean, just to get that signature. And I think that's where a lot of the problem is, you know, because I've tried to get into the to the university as well, but all through the high schools here, right? I said, look, why don't we have a combat veteran with a lot of experience come in and talk to these kids about what it's really like?
Well, that's exactly why I think this program. I mean, I think it's important at the high school level. This is why I do this. Is part of it is a lot of times a lot of our young people, the first person they encounter, the only person they might encounter in their lives is a recruiter.
Right.
And the recruiters, I love our recruiters. The recruiters here in Missoula are great. I love them. They recruited my son. But yeah, they have to sell. I mean, whether whatever level. So you're making my point. Why veterans? Why studying veterans? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Please.
No. Why studying veterans is important. Is exactly. Anyway, let's keep going. These are great points. Yeah.
Just a note on your description of homecoming benefits for veterans in terms of application of what their experience and positive things in civilian life. Would you describe those as evenly or disproportionate between returning retired officer and retired enlisted components?
Yeah, I mean,
I can tell you that from the list side.
It's gotten better. I mean, obviously, World War, if you look back at, I mean, not that we should be on a sliding scale, but I mean, obviously, African American vets got almost no GI Bill benefits after World War II. So things have gotten better. But yeah, I mean, I think, I'm a benefit of the GI Bill. So I get fantastic medical care. I get fantastic, which is uneven and bureaucratic and has problems. But I have been such a huge recipient of such great VA benefits. But yeah, there's unevenness. There's
not just the quantitative things you were talking about, just coming back and enjoying a generally positive civilian experience and being able to apply what you've learned and reintegrating.
Well, so much in American society comes down to education. So obviously, officers are going to have an advantage because so much of American life requires, wants to have a college degree now. I don't know if I can talk to it, Tate. I don't know if I can address it. I know that the benefits for the modern American veteran are pretty good. I mean, the GI Bill benefits, the VA works really hard to try to support its veterans. But yes, there's still a lot of work to be done.
It is part of the problem. I mean, we've had a VA since what, World War II?
Well, even before then,
yeah. And we're still having these problems.
Yeah.
Like when I first came here, I dislocated my knee because I was, training so hard. Went over to the VA, like, hey man, I think I need to get an X-ray. I felt a crack in my femur. I'm like, oh yeah, dude, you got to go to hell. I'm like, it's a fucking hospital, 2 minutes away. Nobody's seeing veterans. And I'm sitting there going, wait, what?
It's tough.
So I happened to end up, by accident, meeting with Tester, Tester. Granted, I didn't know who he was at the time, so he got a little bit of an earful. I'm sure it's been years since he's been talking.
He gets a lot of earfuls, yeah.
But, then my thing was, he's like, well, I'm a big proponent of the VA, da, da, da. I was like, okay, then why can't I get an x-ray? And he's standing there like, well, I have no idea what's going on down here, da, da. And I was like, well, sir, you say you're in charge of the VA from Montana. How do you not know what's going on? Oh, because you're talking to the heads of the VA for each city, right? And everything's great, sir. And I was like, so why has no bills been paid in Missoula? He's like, I have no idea. I said, was the money allocated? He's like, of course. Okay, well, somebody's getting rich off of this shit, because we're not.
Yeah.
Right? And that was where I started I completely disavowed the VA. They are a guilt to me, and this is a personal experience. Having to go get blood drawn at 1600, right? And they're like, you're fasting, right? So it's fucking midnight? No. I mean, you don't want me to fast for 16 hours. And those are the kind of things where after a while, and the first thing they ask, oh, what was your rank? Why does that matter? I'm fucking retired. But if I said I was a brigadier general, I bet you'd fly on your fucking feet, huh? And that's where a lot of, I think, the discontent, I don't know if you guys have seen some of the same stuff, I don't know. That was just what I saw. Because I went in, hey, I don't know anything about the VA, I'm going to come here with an open mind.
Yeah.
I go in there, and my right arm is still attached, and I'm looking at the guy like, hey, how you doing? He's like, what's up? You gotta get on your fucking feet when you talk to me. He goes, why? And I was like, what do you mean, why? He's literally sitting like this. What do you need? I was like, I need to be seen, bro. And and then it's like, oh, you clearly, you're mad. You got problems. And I'm like, well, you're disrespectful. And then, so how do you look at it, right? And those are the kind of things where it's hard, I think, at least it was for me, and it still is for me, right? Yeah. I hear people bitch about they don't have their latte at Starbucks. I'm going to put a hole in it.
Yeah. That's that's exactly what you're talking about. The VA, there's so many different experiences. I agree. I agree. The VA can be incredibly challenging. I've had a lot of my own challenges with the VA healthcare. But again, it's a huge organization. But again, part of it is we've got now 20 years. Not to mention Vietnam veterans, but we have 20 years of veterans. And you know what? They're all doing claims. Now you are mandatory, you have to do a claim when you get out of the military. So we have an entire generation of now, going on 20 years of combat veterans that all have claims into the VA. So the system is clogged, and then there's these, like you're talking about, these cultural challenges, dealing with, some places in the VA are good, some are in others. They've tried to privatize some of the VA, which is causing all kinds of problems. But no, these are great questions, and we could definitely talk more about the VA. Let's come back to that, okay? Yeah, no. The VA is another huge issue. But anyway, yeah, let me go on, and then we can come back to that. What I want to end with is just a little, again, this comes from this idea that obviously most of us are not islands unto ourselves. So the military family, when we talk about the veterans' experience, it's a family experience for most veterans. We have these, I've never seen this show, but Army Housewives or Army something wives. Army Wives, thank you. I've never seen it. But these are stereotypes as well, right? You have these stereotypes of military life for families. But some of these stereotypes are also true. The deployment cycle has wound down a bit since 2011, since we pulled a lot of forces out, but we still have significant numbers of troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, which means the deployment cycle for most units is brutal. You have a unit, you have a run-up to a deployment, and I'm talking about conventional units now. The Special Forces community has a completely different operational tempo. But for a regular military unit, a regular Army unit, for example, or even a Marine Corps unit, you have this train-up period, and the family's on pins and needles, and then you have the deployment period. And what does the deployment period look like now? You may have a service member that's out on a patrol in the morning, and then he's Skyping with his wife and his baby at night, and the baby's got, flushed and has a fever and a runny nose, and that service member who was literally maybe in a firefight at 8 o'clock that morning now is on a Skype with his spouse, and she mentions, he's like, well, what's wrong with, with our baby? And, he's got a cold, and I'll take him to but, the car broke down last week. And now you have, so what we're talking about is not just a deployment cycle, but we're talking about conflicts now for our veterans where the home front and the front lines are a Skype away from each other. This isn't a 3-week letter from, the Ardennes in World War II, or a 2-week letter from Korea, or a 1-week letter from Vietnam. These are Skypes where these service members and these families are living almost the same war together, but totally apart. So we could talk about this all day, but this deployment cycle is a real thing for military families. And then there's the post-deployment cycle. I call it the prom effect. You're so excited about prom and about going, and it's going to be perfect, or your wedding's going to be perfect. Redeployment's going to be perfect. But then you have to try to reintegrate movies like, reintegrate that service member back into the family unit, which has been doing okay without him or her for 12 or 15 months. These are just some things to think about. There's movies like The Hurt Locker or American Sniper that show this and trying to show the reintegration. And we're not even talking about a service member that is physically or mentally wounded. Just the average service member trying to reintegrate into that family when that spouse has been holding down the fort, maybe taking care of 3 small children. When I got back from when I had my youngest son, I left him when he was 8 months old. My older one was 5 years old to go to Afghanistan. The 8-month-old had been born in between Afghanistan, or Iraq and Afghanistan, which is typical. I left for Afghanistan. I came home. My then husband and I had about 4 weeks together, and then he went to Iraq for another 15 months. And I was home with 2 little kids, still working. I was an active duty officer at the time at 10th Mountain Division, very high, busy job. I can tell you what, staying at home with those 2 kids was 100 times harder than being deployed. I love my kids, but being a single mom at home with 2 young children was hard. It was hard. And that's what our spouses are dealing with, whether it's a male or female. They're at home dealing, holding down those complicated life, whereas the service member might be getting, IED'd or mortared, but his or her life is probably fairly simple. So again, the military, and I'm going to get through this quick because you guys have been great for an hour here. But don't forget, the military lifestyle, it's not a job. It is a lifestyle. That spouse doesn't, have a service or husband or whatever who comes home after 40 hours a week. If she's a teacher or a nurse, she can't have a certification because she's moving every 2 to 3 years. So how does she get her education done or his education done or hold a certification? It is a full-time family commitment, and oh, by the way, that family is under a microscope all the time because that's the nature of the military. If you're a Guard or reservist in Montana, you're not on that nice post where everybody knows what you're going through. You might live in Havre, and your service member is deployed, and you're sort of on your own. You might have family around, but they don't know what you're going through. This is what military families go through. It is a lifestyle, not just a job. These are just some funny things I throw out there. That military spouses go through. Military life is having a plan, then a new plan, then another plan, then the first plan, and then the brand new plan, only go back to the second plan. I mean, that's military life, right? You're all of a sudden in one place, and 3 weeks later, you're someplace else. And then military children, near and dear to my heart. When my son was a freshman at Hellgate, I was talking to one of his counselors and teachers, and he'd been to 8 different schools by 9th grade, 2 different kindergartens, 2 different second grades. That's typical for a military brat, and he's a great kid. He's a great young man now, but that really requires some different life skills to be able to jump around like that, especially when you know that your parents might be in harm's way. So these are just some things to think about, and finally, parent and caregiver support. This is not just spouses and children that are dealing with this. When we talk about this generation, a lot of which have severe physical wounds or mental wounds, there's a lot of parents now that are taking care of their former soldiers, their wounded warriors, or they're grandparenting. My parents took care of my kids when I deployed twice. So this involves all of American society, I think, is what I'm really trying to say. So to put this all of these disparate things into context, what I'm trying to say here is I think that there is an argument to be made that veterans go through a very unique experience in American life. Whether they ever go to war or not, even just going through the military for 4 years as an 18-year-old, your worldview is probably going to be affected. you've been through something different, you go back to a hometown or a different education, you have a different worldview. Now, if you throw combat on top of that, family things on top of that, you've got really a unique experience in American culture. I think there's really interesting ways to have conversations in our communities about that. But it's not, again, all bad news. It's not just a bunch of, of service members that have issues. They also, our veterans are an incredibly vibrant part of American society that contribute every day. So some food for thought. Obviously, we're not going to go through that, but these are other issues that veterans go through. Questions?
Do you think the removal of the draft just kind of exacerbated the gap between civilian reality and military reality, that only a small number of people left would serve in the Army, whereas before, anybody could be called up at any time?
Yeah, I do. I personally believe in, I think national service, that's personal viewpoint, not necessarily military, but I think national service is a good thing. But yeah, so American military has been all volunteer since 1973. So everyone now who serves is obviously a volunteer, which means a lot of it tends to come from families. Military service tends to run in families. Because of the all-volunteer force, it tends to be demographic in some ways, certain parts of the country, although I think that's overblown. It's not just all of rural America that's, serving in the military. People come from everywhere in the country. But there is this, there is a disconnect between some of our civilian and military families. However, now that we've been at war for 20 years. The number of people in Congress that are veterans has gone up. So some of those are changing, but yeah, I think.
Well, continuing that, consider the building we're in. It was part of the fort. Built 1890s, 1910 for an Army which was primarily a West Point Alumni Association with some long and short-term enlisted hired help.
Right.
Fast forward to the era we grew up in, 14 million World War II veterans, big DOD, big VA, everyone we know came into contact with selective service or officer training at some point. Now we fast forward to 2017, 19, much smaller replacement component of active duty veterans, 2 million Gulf War, 2 million Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined, 2 to 3 million. What does it say? What are the ramifications? Going back a little bit, and in that period I talked about to begin with, 1890s, minimal veteran support. If you do 30 years as an enlisted man, you might get into the Soldiers' Home in D.C. That's pretty much it in terms of support. If we go back to a period where people rarely encounter an active duty soldier, where the Army is all concentrated in the South due to training requirements, people in Montana, New York, Minnesota never run into active duty people. We have a very small veterans component. It's no longer all the people you meet at Rotary Club. It's the brother of the guy who worked on my car once. I think he went to Iraq way back when. What does that say for reception and treatment of veterans by the mid-21st century, assuming this trend line continues?
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's why we have a gap. There's a culture gap, there's a knowledge gap, there's an understanding gap. And which is why I think so many of these stereotypes persist about veterans. That veterans are, and I argue that veterans are a unique culture, but they're also your normal neighbor, So it's either these extremes of this hero worship of veterans, like they're all Boy Scouts and they all need to be put on these pedestals, or they're all these super disturbed, it seems to be extremes of stereotypes, because a lot of people just don't know or don't have a veteran in their family.
You could know that also be Hollywood.
Yeah, and it's Hollywood, and it's
I
Hollywood.
There's the 12 Strong.
Yeah. It was a fun movie.
It was a fun movie. But American Sniper and all that stuff. If anybody knows anything about him, and it infuriates me. Knowing the background of all these, like Lone Survivor, complete bullshit. But again, I can't sit there and say that in an average group. Like, oh my God! I was like, dude, I'm sorry to dampen your little, fluffy cloud there. But as long as we keep BSing, about what the world is really like, we're not getting anywhere. You know, I mean, I see a guy, he fucking drives me crazy in the gym. He's maybe 19 years old. He walks around. He's just like, he mugs everybody. He's got this disgruntled vet, stay back 100 meters. And I just want to go crack him because I'm like, fuck it, let's see what you got, bro. You know, because it's become this whole stereotype now. Like, so I guess you have mountain nightmares. But no.
Yeah, but that's why we need to break. We need to break down the stereotypes, right?
You know, and one of the things that I hate, and this is just me, and you know, I don't know if you guys have gone through it too. You know, that's why I don't like to go to group things, right? Because when they say, "Oh, Mark, what did you do?" Well, I spent 21 years with Jason, and they're like, they're so calm. They're like, "Oh, well, my PTSI is not as bad as you." You know, I've never been. I mean, how do you know? Maybe you were in a fucking 4-month firefight, dude. I mean, you look at the Tet Offensive. I mean, until I started studying that, I didn't even. I'm from Denmark originally, you know, so we didn't really get a whole lot of Vietnam history and stuff. But I got totally into it. I didn't know how long the Tet Offensive is. I thought it was like a day or two, man. I was sitting there going, holy shit, 180,000 people fighting that. And I'm sitting there going, Jesus Christ, man, that makes, you know, and then I meet Vietnam veterans that are like, I can't even imagine you fought in Soldier City, Fallujah. I'm like, you fought in the jungle? And I was like, and that's when it kind of hit me, like the perspective wise, right? But I think, what, in my opinion, and I get it, you know, I'm probably a little bit more rough around the edges, I guess. Maybe the filter's gone. It is gone. There's no more filter. But
which is not untypical of military people,
right.
but
I mean,
it's okay.
I got mad, what's it called, TBI, when I got blown up last time, you know, skull fractures and stuff. But again, right, and people are like, oh, well, you look like you're doing pretty good. It's like, well, you know, I mean, you don't see the, you know, me climbing out of the bed in the morning, man, before I get, you know, my girlfriend helping me, you know, and stuff like that. Once I get going, you know, I mean, you still got policy from the brain injuries that I have. But people are like, yeah, but you're doing good. And I was like, you know, respectively, right? But then again, it's like, who do you go talk to? Because I can't talk to guys in my generation. The guys that I get to talk to that I feel more comfortable with are Vietnam veterans.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure why that is.
I think that's typical, though. I think it's that because you feel, and part of this is a cultural thing. When you don't, it's hard, I think, for a lot of veterans to talk. They want to know, they want to talk to somebody who knows what they've been through, because it's part of your world, it's part of your identity, right? And yeah, I actually hear that a lot. That you want to talk to, and a lot of, I think, modern veterans, especially if they've been through a lot of things, want to talk to Vietnam veterans, because they're older, maybe older, wiser. I don't know. But no,
I just feel like there's no bullshit with them.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just me who's retarded, I don't know. But it's like, you know, the group things that I just went to a group thing here last Wednesday at the vet center, and I love the vet center, don't get me wrong, I mean, they saved my life. You know, but it's immediately becomes this pissing contest. I'm like, dude, I'm not here to argue about who's done what. Right? I mean, fuck, dude. I mean, we all know Green Berets are better than SEALs. It's not a question. But, you know, we joke around it like that. But it's like, but some people take it really, really seriously.
Yeah.
You know? Like one kid was arguing about, like, you know, they fucking said, you know, war, they forced me to do this. And I'm like, how long were you in? He's like, 2 years. Okay, so you enlisted in a time of war for infantry. And somehow you thought you weren't going to go to war. I was like, dude, that's fucking on you, bro. And then he's like, you're a fucking dick. I get it, I am. But you need to wake up, dude. Nobody owes you shit. You volunteered to go. It is what it is, man. Right? It's not a draft.
No, but you're bringing up. I mean, these are exactly. You've got some, and again, veterans. When we talk about this monolithic veterans, every veteran's going to react differently. Like some are going to come back with chips on their shoulders. Some are going to go like, hey, you know, I'm, you know, or whatever. But you're absolutely right. Everyone's going to react differently. But I think what you're bringing up is absolutely true. There's a lot of sort of unfiltered. Most veterans will approach this from sort of an unfiltered view, right? And the stereotypes that we're talking about, all these Hollywood stereotypes, have a different view. It tends to be very filtered. It tends to be very filtered. Anyway, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I just had a thought about Kate's question. I didn't want to forget. You know, the trend line that says maybe you'll be less and less apt to know of it or understand the experience. I've been to some of Elizabeth's talks before, and usually by now the phrase "thank you for your service" comes up, and the ambiguity vets will have about that, as though it's just such a rote thing to say sometimes, that it's actually not a comfortable compliment to receive, because there's a feeling maybe that it's just too easy to say and the experience is not truly understood or something.
But it shows. Yeah.
I think that should be a chapter in a book in and of itself. Thank you for your service.
I never know what to say.
You don't know what to say, right? But that exactly makes the point you just made, Mark. Is this idea that so many veterans will react to it. I mean, when people say it to me, if I get my Lowe's discount, which is really nice, you know, they'll say thank you for your service. I'm like, oh, thank you. You know, I feel awkward. But for some veterans, you know, if they have moral injury, if they feel like they were part of like a war that they shouldn't have been in, or if they did, you know, or whatever, or if they feel like the American public really didn't care about them, they were at the mall while I was at work. There's so many different reactions to that phrase. For some people, it's just nice to hear it. For other people, it can really trigger you to be like mad. So when we're talking about, I think these are great points. I mean, obviously, when I do believe there is a thing called the veterans experience, but I think it has so many different ways of manifesting. I think there are some things that are sort of common, leaving this tight-knit group, having been through something really tough and hard and physical, having been through some type of ethical, you know, dilemmas in your life. But so many veterans will react so differently to that service. They'll react differently to having been wounded or not wounded. Some get PTS, some don't. Some get moral injury, some don't. Some hate the phrase "thank you for your service," you know, because they either feel like it's hollow or they didn't deserve it or whatever. But anyway, this is great.
The only one I had was here in Missoula at JCPenney's. My cousin bought a jacket or whatever, and I said, "Hey, you got the best military discount." You know, and she's like, "I think so. Hang on, we got 1 cent discount."
Really?
And she's like, "Thank you for your service." Like, you know what, man? And I lost my shit. I'm not gonna lie. I was like, you know what? That's a slap in the face, dude. I said, 1 cent. It was we paid $48 in cash. We got 1 cent back because it was $47.99.
Yeah.
And I was like, and then she said, "Well, thank you for your service anyway." Yeah. And I was like, and I gotta lie, I usually don't get triggered by stuff, but that shit set me off. And I was like, "Go get your manager right now," because I was like, I mean, that's like, yeah, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah.
I was hoping you bought a gumball or something.
Right, I was
40
like,
cents, okay.
What can I buy with 1 cent? If
5 cents discount.
And luckily there's, I know, and maybe she misread.
Nope.
Yeah.
No, it was on the receipt.
Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're sitting there going, wow, man. I mean, I've found, well, I think Lowe's actually gives an Ace here, Ace.
Home Depot, yeah.
Paul's Pancake.
Yes, Paul's Pancakes. The best fucking pancakes in the world. Man.
But really?
But it's like, those things are, I mean, but then you look at, okay, how many veterans really come in there?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, well, you have to be in uniform. Like, but I'm a veteran.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you have uniform. I'm like, okay, I was in special operations. This is my uniform.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
but you can see though with these things. I mean, that was a horrible. That one thing is horrible. But you can see how so many American businesses and they're trying to make up in a lot of ways for Vietnam. I mean, they're trying to make up for some of the ways that guys like my father, that they were, yeah. But you know, so you can see that they're, you know, this talk about this disconnect that you're talking about, Tate, is that so many Americans are trying to bridge this civilian-military gap. You know, whether you know we go to a national service where everybody's got to do some kind of service to the country. I don't, you know, unless we go to a major war, I don't see a draft coming again. But there's these ideas of trying to bridge these. You know, let's try to bridge this disconnect we have between veterans. Show gratefulness to their service and what they've been through, especially since, you know, with almost 20 years of war. But it's challenging. It is challenging. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I guess it's very much reflective of the world veterans come back to. If anybody coming into a church or social or club function in the 1950s was greeted with "thank you for your service," and the room was full of fellow veterans, it would seem a little bit bizarre, you know, because the rule of thumb is everybody in the room who's a veteran did more than you, so why are you passing out accolades on each other?
Yeah.
But the alternative to that is, well, where were you and what did you do again? Because it is attempt to bridge. It might be an imperfect bridge, but again, the alternative is apathy and misunderstanding.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly better than taking a bunch of, especially, goodness, draftees, and you know, during the Vietnam War, who were sent off. A lot of our especially, a lot of them from the poor families who were not in college, the ones that were drafted, the ones that were sent off, and then blaming them for a lot of political decisions and taking it on the veterans. So I think the American society as a whole, if you can ever, I'm way overgeneralizing, has now embraced the fact that you can separate blaming an individual veteran for a political decision. So that's a huge, I think, step forward for a society. But again, and I raised this earlier, I think it's also incredibly important for Americans to understand when you commit your treasure to a conflict like Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever, it's not a 5-year commitment, it's not a 10-year commitment. These service members will have a lifetime of potential good and bad things happen to them based on their service. You know, they may become incredibly resilient, great business entrepreneurs because of what they learned in the military, but they may wake up when they're 70 years old and also realize they do have post-traumatic stress. Sometimes it doesn't manifest for 30 or 40 years. So it's a lifetime commitment for a nation to have a military. You know, we're not, there are some small countries on the planet that have chosen not to have militaries. We have a military, but it's a lifetime commitment for every one of those service members. And I think that's sometimes lost. Yeah.
When's the next class you're going to hold at the College?
On that note, if you want to talk about more things, if anyone else has questions, otherwise I've kept you a long time. I appreciate it. We are offering our next class in the fall semester. Yeah, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9:30. So Missoula College, again, part of what we're talking about here is bridging this gap, right? If you're a young undergraduate at University of Montana and you're going to go be a social worker, you can, there are classes now where you can go and try to understand. Obviously, you're never going to get the full culture if you haven't been through it, but you can understand a little bit more about the veterans' experience through a class. And it's a class. But anyway, it'll be for the next 4 semesters starting this fall. Yeah.
You know what I'm making, Lee? That center? Yeah.
I know her name. I know her name.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, she's like a fucking goddess to me, man.
Yeah.
She's helping me.
Is she a counselor?
Yeah, she's a counselor. Well, an amazing lady, man. And I hated her so much in the beginning. But you fucking hit me, man. Fucking telling me that. She just kept giving me points I couldn't argue.
Yeah.
So like, well, shit. What I'm getting at, and what I worked out with Megan, because she wants me to be a guest speaker in the fall for something with the doctorate program, like social work.
Yeah, probably, yeah. They do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, because the problem that doctors are masters.
It might be, it's probably the graduate school, yeah.
But, because my thing was like, yeah, but, you guys are up all there teaching this shit, you have to serve. Well, how about you get some real fucking people in there? It's like, dude, this is, like, for example, I went to one at, I'm part of the CIT training for the local law enforcement. Okay. It's called Critical Incident Training. Yeah. Especially for veterans, because I had an incident with a couple of cops here when I first moved in and stuff. CIT, Critical Incident Training.
Gotcha.
And it's like certain officers and EMTs, paramedics, and whatever.
Yeah.
And because of what happened to me when I first moved here, I was about to kill 3 cops because they came to my house and were super aggressive with me, and I drew down on them. And I was like, holy shit, dude. But I remember the rush that I felt like that. And they're like, oh shit, you guys lost, man, you're fucking done. And the power that I felt was amazing. And then I started thinking back, dude, what if I shot him? Fuck, dude, I'd be in prison for the rest of my life, right? Over a health and welfare. Right? I mean, if you just told me why you were here, it would have been okay. But if you start yelling at me, and then one female cop went like that, it was her taser, I didn't realize that, so I drew first. And then we sat there the next day with the so forth downtown, with the sheriff and everything. And I was like, well, I mean, so we're all cool, right? And they're like, yeah. I said, and I was like, do you have any questions for me or whatever? And the female was like, I just have one question. And I was like, okay, this probably could be really profound. Because she almost pissed herself, right? And she was like, why do you carry a gun at home at night? And I was like, that's the only thing you got out of this whole thing. I said, because people like you roll up. I don't know. I mean, and it was baffled to me. And when I hear some of these people at these CIT training things, man, I hate to say it, but it's all PowerPoint shit.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I run that, and it's even tougher because I teach online. I mean, I'm teaching at Eastern Kentucky online, which is even tougher because I can't. I mean, how do you teach? I'm going to grab something for you real quick. one thing that if you're interested in this more, how do you teach what a veteran has been through with these are visceral experiences. How do you teach it on PowerPoint? How do I teach it on an online class, which is even harder? You got to try. You just got to try. And I think one thing, we actually have a huge Homeland Security Department curriculum at Eastern Kentucky University. So a lot of my students are firefighters and cops, and they take our classes because they want to. If they have encounters in the community with veterans, they want to understand, even if it's this much more about what a veteran has experienced in their lives, or maybe what their kid has experienced, what kids like our kids have experienced. So you just got to try. You got to try to bridge that gap. This is the book. If you are interested in sort of reading literature, reading stories from real veterans, or even, there's excerpts here from Homer, from ancient Greece. There's excerpts here from Walt Whitman, and then a lot of modern American vets, World War II vets, and Korean vets, and modern American vets that try to, through literature and history, really talk about the veterans' experience. It's just a great book. I use it. It's called Standing Down, put out by the Great Books Foundation. But yeah, how do you get at those? How do you get it? How do you teach it? So I think we just keep trying. Yeah.
Across the street, and open up the military museum. After
Great.
You're done here, feel free to come on over.
Everybody, I'm still here if you want to talk more, but thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it. Christiana. Yeah. Mark was great.